Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Little Book of Psychology, an introduction to the key psychologists and theories you need to know, by Emily Rawls and Caroline Riggs, narrated by Jennifer M. Dixon. Publisher's note: this audiobook may refer to visual elements included in the print and e-book editions of the book. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Carl Sagan. Introduction. The human brain is the only living thing that can study itself. Perhaps that is the reason you picked up this book. Not only can the brain study itself, it is also capable of doing so while processing an incredible amount of information from your surroundings. For example, while you are listening to this, your brain is receiving information as electrical signals from your ears. It is instantly recognizing where it has heard these sounds before, recalling that they represent letters and words, and linking them to the meanings it has paired them with in the past. At the same time, your brain may not have drawn your attention to the sounds that are around you. It is constantly filtering out tones that may not be an immediate danger to you. It has already decided that it is safe for you to ignore these sounds, but would instantly alert you if a saber-toothed tiger walked into the room. Perhaps you are not currently aware that your hypothalamus, in the middle of your brain, has received signals from your skin and monitored the temperature of the environment that you are in. It has made adjustments to keep your vital organs at a constant temperature. It could be that you are now slowly becoming more distracted from these words as we point out that you are blinking without much consideration, and that you have stopped noticing which parts of your body are touching the chair you may be sitting in, or how your feet are resting on the floor. Your brain was taking care of all of this while trying to learn about itself. 100 billion neurons are taking care of you while simultaneously being you. These biological processes in the brain that contribute to our day-to-day experiences and behavior can be observed, measured, and manipulated using a variety of modern scientific techniques. These days, we can observe the brain as it processes information in real time by using brain scanning techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. But this was not always the case, and the biological study of the brain itself represents only one element in the study of psychology. While we now understand that the brain may be said to contain the mind, there are many facets of human experience that cannot be observed using biological techniques and require more subtle and more subjective reasoning to attempt to understand them. Throughout this book, we will discuss various attempts in the history of psychology to explain our behaviors, from the more traditionally scientific approaches, such as biological and behavioral psychology, to the more subjective approach of Freud and psychodynamic psychology. The history of psychology. It's difficult to know where to begin when describing the history of psychology. In part, this is due to the difficulty in separating the study of psychology from that of philosophy. In ancient Greece, philosophers discussed subjects that we would commonly associate with psychology today, such as the soul, the mind, and the nature of thought. However, it wasn't until around the 1800s that psychology emerged as a discipline in its own right, when German scientist Wilhelm Wundt began using the scientific method to study human behavior. Wundt's 1874 book, Principles of Physiological Psychology, was a first major attempt to link the studies of physiology, how our organs and organ systems function, and human behavior. He opened the first official Institute for Experimental Psychology in Leipzig, Germany, in 1879, and pioneered the use of introspection as a research method. Try introspection. Light a candle and watch it flicker. Play a single note on an instrument or smell a flower. Now say out loud how this makes you feel, or what thoughts you have. This is introspection, examining your own mental processes. Wundt's method of introspection was innovative because he was attempting to study the thought processes themselves rather than observable behavior or the structure of the brain in isolation. Participants were guided to examine and report their own internal thoughts and to self-observe. Trained staff would monitor the experience, presenting planned sensory stimuli in a controlled way, such as sounding a metronome or turning on a light. Wundt recognized the importance of using experimental methods to study human behavior and emphasized the need to be able to repeat an experiment within the same conditions so that the reliability of results could be tested. Since then, the scientific study of human behavior has flourished, with psychologists employing the scientific method with varying degrees of rigor to explain how the interaction between our biology and our experiences can shape our behavior. In this book, we will discuss the major fields of study in psychology today, from Freud's psychodynamic approach, which emerged in the early 20th century, to modern brain imaging techniques. The biological approach. Where our thoughts and behaviors originate from has been a source of much reflection by philosophers and scientists during human history, and is still not a question with an absolute answer. However, as our understanding of biology improves, so does our understanding of psychology. In this chapter, we will explore the anatomy of the brain, the influence of genetics, and how our evolutionary past may have influenced human behavior. It was around 2,500 years ago that Hippocrates first argued that it was the brain that was responsible for human thought and consciousness, and not the heart, as Aristotle believed. During the centuries that followed, many theories were put forward about how the brain may contribute to the human experience, including the Greek philosopher and surgeon Galen's ideas, developed in the 2nd century CE, but still popular even as late as the 17th century, that the brain acted almost like a pump, pushing fluid through nerves to our organs. If it wasn't for scientists' morbid experiments attempting to reanimate executed prisoners in the 19th century, we may never have considered that our bodies were actually controlled by electrical signals travelling to and from our brains. At a time when electricity was not yet widely used, this was an important development in our knowledge of biology. However, it didn't matter how inspired scientists were by the idea of an electrically charged biological supercomputer controlling our bodies. They unfortunately lacked the medical knowledge to keep a willing patient alive long enough to open up their skull and actually observe anything. In a time before brain imaging technology, such as magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, and positron emission tomography, PET scanners, our information came from the misfortunes of people who had endured horrendous injuries and survived, allowing scientists to observe the changes to their personality, behavior, or memory as a result. The most famous of these case studies took place in 1848 when Phineas Gage, an American railway construction foreman, suffered a brain injury when a 43-inch-long iron pole was propelled through his skull during a workplace accident. Gage was using the pole to tamp explosives into a hole during the construction of a railroad bed in Vermont. The pole pierced Gage's frontal lobe, but miraculously did not kill him. It did, however, leave him with impaired cognitive functions and personality changes. Gage's doctor, Dr. John Harlow, and friends reported that he had become more impulsive and less able to control his anger after the accident. The evidence surrounding Gage's case is limited, and in recent years researchers have questioned the accuracy of some sources, but whether or not his case has been embellished or distorted, it remains the first known reported case in which brain damage caused alterations in personality. Doctors at the time were able to hypothesize that these personality changes were a direct result of Gage's injury, meaning that this unfortunate incident pointed the way and helped us to start mapping the brain. From further case studies and by using new brain imaging techniques, we now know that the frontal lobe, which had been damaged in Gage's case, is indeed linked to controlling our impulses, which can vary from resisting the urge to devour another biscuit to the compulsive behaviors that are seen in disorders such as obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and addiction. There are 4 lobes that make up the human brain: the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. Each of these lobes is associated with specific functions. The frontal lobe is responsible for our executive functions, the higher-level processes that allow us to make decisions, think creatively, and initiate or inhibit actions. In the temporal lobe, memories and language are processed for understanding, while the parietal lobe helps us perceive, interpret, and make sense of the world. Finally, the occipital lobe processes information from our eyes, splitting it into smaller categories such as visual tone, pattern, and distance. There is also an area of the occipital lobe dedicated to recognizing faces, which explains our talent for seeing faces in the patterns of clouds or burnt pieces of toast. 2 strips along the top of the brain receive signals from specific parts of the body, processing movement and sensation. If a person suffers an injury and loses a limb, it is the corresponding parts of the motor and sensory cortex that undergo extreme remapping and, for example, can result in phantom limb syndrome in amputees. Signals are transferred within and between these lobes from all over the body through neurons. Neurons are cells that are specially adapted to carry the electrical impulses that allow us to think and feel. These electrical impulses are conducted along neurons at a speed of up to 119 meters per second, passing messages from our sense organs, such as the skin, eyes, and nose, to our brains to be interpreted and acted upon. Electrical impulses pass between neurons with the help of neurotransmitters, which are chemical messengers that can travel across the synapse, the small gap, between one neuron and another. You may have heard of neurotransmitters such as serotonin or dopamine, which are associated with various cognitive functions such as happiness, memory, attention, and so on. The structure of a neuron. Impulses travel through the neuron from the dendrites to the axon terminals. The word dendrite comes from the Greek, meaning tree, as they are small branches projecting from a neuron that connect with the axon terminals of neighboring neurons. Axon terminals release neurotransmitters, such as dopamine and serotonin, that carry the impulses across the synapse, the small gap between dendrites and axon terminals, and are then received by the dendrite of the next neuron, where the journey begins again. Neuromyth. We only use 10% of our brains. False. We use all of our brains all of the time, although some areas might be working harder than others, depending on the task we are doing. In the last analysis, the entire field of psychology may reduce to biological electrochemistry. Sigmund Freud. Wrapped across the entire surface of the brain are folds and fissures, creating an immense surface area that, without a blood supply, appears grey. This is due to the huge amount of myelin sheath, a fatty wrap around these elongated neurons that helps to conduct the electrical signals traveling across your brain. As you hear this, pathways of electrical signals are traveling between all of your lobes, creating memories and linking to previous processing without you feeling like you are waiting on any kind of information retrieval. It is beautifully connected. Our amazing and complicated brains never stop learning. The brain constantly adapts to our demanding environments, reallocating its resources depending on what we are asking it to do. For example, studies have shown that when people learn demanding tasks, such as how to juggle or play video games, the structures of their brains actually change as a result of these activities. For instance, London taxi drivers have been found to have an enlarged area of the brain known as the hippocampus. The hippocampus is associated with memory, and taxi drivers certainly need reliable memories when negotiating the winding streets of London. An evolutionary perspective. Changes to the brain have occurred over a much longer time, too. Evolutionary psychologists would suggest that current human behavior is a response to the pressures we were under during our early evolution, and many of our behaviors were developed through natural selection to help us survive in our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. Humans appear to have changed very little in the last 100,000 years, so considering what might have been a behavioral advantage for our ancestors during this time could give us an insight into the original purposes of our current behaviors. Darwin's theory of natural selection suggests that the organisms that are best suited to their environment will survive and reproduce, passing their successful traits on to their offspring. To understand the evolutionary approach in psychology, we have to be aware of what this early environment was like and understand how it is different from the ways we live now. We have to assume that many of our current behaviors were at one point adaptive in helping us with our need to pass on our genes in this environment. This is a concept that Richard Dawkins famously referred to as the selfish gene. For example, it may seem obvious that for our genes to be passed on, our offspring must survive, and therefore many of the maternal and paternal feelings we have towards our children are clearly an adaptive advantage. However, what might be less obvious is why we would choose to help others and behave altruistically. What possible evolutionary advantage could there be in that? Well, it could be that cooperating with others, whether they are directly related to us or not, helps us all in the long run. We benefit from working with other members of our species to help us survive, so even behaviors that do not obviously seem to fit the pattern of the selfish gene may ultimately be influenced by our evolutionary past. During our early evolution, we may have benefited from dividing our food fairly, communicating goals and strategies, sharing knowledge, and supporting our group. The individuals who were able to behave in such a cooperative way would have had an advantage over others, and therefore would have been more likely to survive, breed, and pass on their seemingly altruistic genes to the next generation. The future of this area of psychology is very exciting. More portable versions of MRI scanners are being developed, which will allow us to scan the brains of patients in battlefields or in remote hospitals in poorer countries. Researchers at the University of Nottingham are working on creating wearable brain scanning equipment that uses quantum sensors to help us detect and precisely map the tiniest changes in the electrical signals that are our thoughts. Implanted man-made diamonds may be able to bridge missing or damaged neural connections due to the diamond's superconducting properties, allowing the electrical nerve impulse to be carried forward where the neural pathway has been broken. This could possibly even allow us to reverse neurodegenerative disorders. In the last few years, scientists from the University of Cambridge were the first to be able to grow cerebral cortex cells, the brain's grey matter, from a sample of skin cells. This allowed them to watch diseases such as Alzheimer's develop in real time, to develop drugs to combat these diseases, and to potentially increase our understanding of how the brain recovers its ability to function after injury. Scientists at the Yale School of Medicine have also been able to use these micro-brains to investigate how the brains of people with autism develop differently from the brains of non-autistic individuals. Our understanding of the biology of our brain and behavior is likely to increase hugely in the next few decades, alongside advances in other areas of biology, and what we discover is very likely to be both fascinating and awe-inspiring. The psychodynamic approach. Sigmund Freud is arguably the most famous psychologist of all. The image of Freud psychoanalyzing a patient while they recline on a couch is synonymous with psychological therapy. He is tremendously well known outside his own field and has contributed many phrases and new word meanings to the English language, despite most of his major works being written originally in German. The concept of a Freudian slip is well known, and Freud is also credited with providing the first known example of the use of the word anxiety to describe a morbid state of mind in his 1909 work on hysteria. However, despite his major contributions to the study of the mind, many of Freud's concepts and theories have fallen out of fashion. They are accused of being male-centered, representing a Victorian-era view of sexuality, with many of his theories being untestable and therefore unfalsifiable, meaning that they cannot be scientifically proven or disproven. In this chapter, we will explore some of Freud's major theories and discuss the impact that they have had on the study of the mind. The mind is like an iceberg. It floats with 1/7 of its bulk above water. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was born the eldest of 8 children in Moravia, now the Czech Republic, on the 6th of May 1856 to Jewish parents. In 1860, his family moved to Vienna, where his father, a wool merchant, sought new business opportunities in order to support his young family. Freud had ambitions to become a lawyer and go into politics. However, after graduating from school, he decided to turn his attention to his urge to understand something about the mysteries of the world and maybe contribute somewhat to their understanding. At the age of 17, he attended the University of Vienna Medical School, publishing his first paper about the sexual organs of eels in 1877. Maybe a hint about some of his future theories of the mind. After graduating, Freud specialized in researching the brain and nervous system at the Vienna General Hospital, and later, as an intern in Paris, he went on to develop an interest in the use of hypnosis to treat hysteria and neurosis. He opened his own practice in 1886, specializing in nervous disorders, and 10 years later, in 1896, the death of his father encouraged Freud to study his own dreams, leading to the publication of his famous work, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1900. In 1902, Freud took a post as professor of neuropathology at the University of Vienna, where he met other like-minded academics. He was part of several groups that met to discuss the analysis of the mind. Each Wednesday, he would invite a small group of physicians to meet in his apartment and discuss psychology and neuropathology, creatively named the Psychological Wednesday Society. This group later developed into the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society and later the International Psychoanalytic Association, IPA, which still exists today. Famous people in psychology have been president of this association at various times, including its first president, Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who was 19 years younger than Freud. The two met in 1907 after Jung sent Freud some of his work, and after a short exchange of letters, Jung travelled to Vienna. It is reported that they hit it off immediately and spent around 13 hours straight discussing psychology on their first meeting. The two men collaborated and delivered lecture tours together, with Freud commenting that Jung was like a son he could pass the reins of psychoanalysis on to, despite the fact he already had a wife and 6 children. However, in 1912, on a lecture tour of America, a feud developed and broke their relationship after Jung publicly criticized Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex. In his 1914 work, The History of the Psychoanalytic Movement, Freud delegitimized Jung's contributions. Some report that this parting was ultimately due to differences of opinion regarding the psychoanalytic approach. Others claim that there were more personal reasons for the break. Regardless of the reasoning, Freud's and Jung's theories were irreversibly intertwined and have many similarities and divergences that we will discuss in this chapter. The start of World War I halted the work of the IPA and Freud. In 1933, the Nazis began burning copies of Freud's published works, and Freud fled Vienna for London, where a replica of his Vienna consulting room was set up for him to continue practicing. After the war, Freud's work concentrated mostly on developing his theories and using them to analyze works of art and literature. He died in 1939, aged 83, not because of the cancer from which he was suffering, but due to receiving an overdose of morphine from his personal physician. He left a lifetime of work that had, and is still having, a significant impact on the field of psychology and beyond. To understand Freud's view of behavior, we need to remind ourselves of the biological approach he took to psychology. As a teenager, Freud bought a first-edition copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species and was fascinated by the concept of evolution by natural selection. If physical traits could be passed on to future generations, why not psychological ones? Freud believed that much of our behavior is the result of unconscious biological urges that are mediated by our conscious mind. This is the basis for what is known as the tripartite personality, which consists of the id, the superego, and the ego. The id exists in our unconscious mind and represents our instinctual biological urges. It consists of 2 major parts, both named after figures in Greek mythology: Eros, the life or sexual instincts, and Thanatos, the death instincts. The id encourages us to be impulsive, take what we want and do what we want. Freud believed that all children are born with a fully developed id, and this encourages them to seek out their basic needs, such as food, in order to survive. The superego is also largely in our unconscious mind, but it can influence our conscious thought. It represents the moral principles that are learned during childhood, meaning that we are not born with a fully functioning superego. It is developed through interaction with our family and society. The superego is formed of 2 parts, the conscience and the ideal self. If we do not live up to the idealized moral principles of the superego, we experience guilt and shame. Finally, we have the ego. The ego represents our conscious self and mediates impulses from the id and moral reasoning from the superego. The ego is ruled by the reality principle. This means that it tries to work out realistic ways to satisfy the id's demands, while also being able to function in society. If we obeyed all of the demands of the id, our behavior would be impulsive and chaotic. so the ego ensures that this doesn't happen. Freud believed that the id and the superego existing in the unconscious mind are in constant conflict as they try to influence the ego in the conscious mind. A psychologically healthy person...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?